China is furious over a new US law that embraces Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement. Beijing's Foreign Affairs Ministry has issued a blistering statement accusing the US of bullying behaviour in enacting the legislation. The new law allows for US sanctions in response to human rights violations against Hong Kong citizens, and it requires an annual review of Hong Kong's special status. But the US president said he won't enforce parts of the law where it interferes with US foreign policy. We get the latest now from CNN's Jeremy Diamond.
President Trump on Wednesday signing legislation that shows the U.S.'s support for protesters in Hong Kong who are protesting the Chinese government's crackdown on the autonomy of that Hong Kong territory. Now, this legislation known as the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act will authorize new sanctions on Chinese and Hong Kong officials who are accused of carrying out human rights abuses in Hong Kong. It would also create an annual review of the U.S.'s special trade relationship with the Hong Kong government, an annual review that would be subject to how autonomous Hong Kong actually remains from mainland China. Now, the president has been extremely resistant to signing this legislation. As recently as a few days before he signed this, he suggested that he might even perhaps veto the legislation. But ultimately, the president colliding with reality, recognizing the overwhelming support in both the House and the Senate veto-proof majorities that authorize this legislation. Nonetheless, the president sending perhaps a bit of a peace offering to the Chinese president as he does sign this legislation. The president saying in a statement accompanying the announcements that he signed this legislation, saying, "I sign these bills out of respect for President Xi, China, and the people of Hong Kong. They are being enacted in the hope that leaders and representatives of China and Hong Kong will be able to amicably settle their differences, leading to long-term peace and prosperity for all." Now, the big question, of course, is how will this impact the ongoing U.S.-China trade negotiations? We know that President Trump has been extremely eager to obtain this trade agreement with China. In fact, he promised President Xi back in June that he would not publicly criticize the Chinese government's actions in Hong Kong as they continue to negotiate this trade agreement. That is how much the president cares about getting to an agreement here. But the Chinese government, for its part, has already signaled that it would retaliate if President Trump did indeed sign this legislation into law, which perhaps explains why President Trump put out this friendly statement accompanying it. Jeremy Diamond, CNN, traveling with the president in Palm Beach.
And CNN's Stephen Zhang joins us live from Beijing. Good to see you, Stephen. As our reporter mentioned, of course, the biggest question here is how this will impact trade negotiations. We'll talk about that in a moment. But just how surprised was China by this move by the United States?
Well, Rosemary, I think they really saw this coming. Given the veto-proof majority, this bill had passed both houses of the U.S. Congress. So I think officials here realized President Trump's hands were tied. That's why within hours of this bill becoming law in the U.S., at least 4 different Chinese government agencies issued very harshly worded statements in addition to a statement from the Hong Kong government. The Chinese Foreign Ministry, for example, in a statement said, and I quote here, "The U.S. has been disregarding facts and distorting truth. It openly backed violent criminals who rampantly smashed facilities, set fire, assaulted innocent civilians, trampled on the rule of law, and jeopardized social order. The egregious and malicious nature of its intentions is fully revealed." So very harsh words, but not surprising given what we have been hearing from senior level Chinese officials in the past few weeks, actually, especially in the last few days. So from Beijing's perspective, this bill serves as the latest reminder that, at least that's what they've been telling the Chinese people, that the U.S. is the biggest black hand behind the chaos in Hong Kong. And the protesters are actually being encouraged by the U.S. to stage a revolution in that territory. But some analysts, of course, also pointing out this is partly because Beijing government is trying to use the U.S. to cover its own mistakes and misjudgment on the whole situation of Hong Kong. Remember, just a few days ago, before Hong Kong held its local district elections, officials here and the state media here were trying to paint this picture of pro-Beijing candidates winning that election. But of course, the exact opposite happened. So there is a bit of covering its own mistakes as well, Rosemary.
And Stephen, with China so angry with this new US law, how might this impact sensitive trade negotiations currently underway with the United States?
This is interesting because in the past few days, we have also seen signs of the Chinese government trying to separate these two issues. Remember, as recently as Tuesday, top negotiators from both sides actually held a phone call during which they reached a consensus to really resolve their trade disputes and agreed to maintain communication on resolving remaining issues so both sides could reach a so-called phase one deal. So I think that's because President Xi, like President Trump, really wants to see this deal happen given the slowing economy here in China. Now, of course, this Hong Kong law would compound these trade talks, but I think, given the political system here, this is a one-party dictatorship. President Xi probably has the advantage of having more power and capacity to deal with domestic backlashes as well as internal opposition within his ruling party.